All right, welcome everybody. It is 6:30. It is time to get started. I want to welcome those of you that are joining us online tonight. Welcome to our class called The Truth About Israel, Unmasking the Lies. Tonight, we're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to talk first, and then we're going to end the class tonight with a couple of videos that I want to show you that I hope will inspire your faith, that will help you to understand that God always keeps His promises, that God is true to His word. Some pretty amazing stuff in relation to Israel. But I want to start out tonight talking about the history of Israeli conflicts, all right? In week one, we've had a couple of weeks so far. We had a break week last week, but in week one, I talked about the reason that Jews are hated worldwide. We kind of went through those reasonings, that historically, the Jewish people have been persecuted. And the number one persecutors of Jewish people for centuries was the church, was the mainline church. And I talked to you about all of that. And then it began to shift to where, when it became convenient for politicians, that the Jews kind of garnered the ire of politicians and governments, and they became the scapegoats for community problems and state problems and national problems. And so they began to, persecute the Jews. We talked about the Russian pogroms. And then, of course, the ultimate persecution of the Jews happened in Germany with the Holocaust with Adolf Hitler. And so we talked about that. We talked a little bit about what it means to support the Jewish people, to say, I stand with Israel. And remember, we talked about when you're telling people that you stand with Israel and we support Israel, what we're saying is we support Israel's right to exist as a nation and the right of the Jewish people to exist as human beings. That's what it means to stand with Israel. To stand with Israel does not mean that we are anti-Arab or anti-Palestinian. We are not. We're pro-everybody, right? God loves everybody. But sometimes, especially in a time like now, when people say, well, I stand with Israel, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything the Israeli government does or that I agree with everything every Jewish person on the planet does. That's not what it means to stand with Israel. Because there are good Jewish people and bad Jewish people, just like there are good Americans and there are bad Americans, right? And their government does some things right and does some things wrong, just like our government does some things right and seems like more and more a lot of things wrong, right? So we all understand that. So you have to define for people, when I say I stand with Israel, I stand with their right to exist as a nation and their right to exist as people. Because those are the two things that are being challenged right now. Their right to exist as a nation and their right to even exist as human beings, right? Which is horrible. And that's why it's so important that you take a stand. A couple of weeks ago, thanks to Pastor Nick, who filled in for me when I had my surgery a couple of weeks ago, I was watching online, and one of the questions that was asked was, well, what can we do with this? How can we stand with Israel? What can we do about what's happening? And here is what you can do about what's happening. You can educate yourself, which you are doing by being a part of this class. And when you're in conversations with people, in your family, in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in this church, or wherever God takes you, and you begin to hear things that you've come to understand are lies, they're not true, what you can do for Israel and the Jewish people is you can stand up and say, you know what? That actually is not correct. And you can take the information that you've been learning in this class and bring truth to bear in that conversation. Because 99.9% of the people in our community that are out there with their opinions of Israel and et cetera, they, first of all, have not had a class like this, obviously, but they haven't even studied the issue. For them, it's an emotional thing. They see something, they hear something on Facebook or TikTok, like that crazy viral thing that went on TikTok about a week ago, and they just emotionally grab onto it and they say, well, I just believe, but there's no rationale, there's no facts, there's no education to what they're saying. They're just parroting, they're just mimicking things that they're hearing other people say, and that's why the best thing that you can do is speak truth into the situation. You know, we can't go over there and fight, we can't do a lot of things, but we can speak truth when we're given the opportunity, when we're with other people and they're saying things and you're like, that's not even true. Walk them through some of the things. So in that first week, we talked about why the Jews are hated worldwide, how you can support Israel. We gave some background, and we're going to come back to that a little bit tonight at one point, as to how Israel became a nation. I want to cement a few things with that tonight. And so what I want to do with our time together tonight is I want to take a little time to help you now to understand the forces and the reasons that have created a continual, and the emphasis is on the word continual, a continual conflict in the Middle East. You would think that we would be able to solve this problem. I mean, rational people in a rational world would be able to solve this problem because there is a solution to this problem that's been going on for centuries. But to bring it to bear on what we're talking about tonight, to bring it in the last few decades, there is a definite solution for what's happening, all right now between Israel and the Palestinians and other Arab nations. But there are some reasons that you need to understand why this is a continuous, ongoing battle, all right? So I want to talk about those reasons tonight. And the first one is this. Reason number one is because of ongoing attacks against Israel. So what's interesting is that in all three wars that Israel has had to fight, so whether that was the War of Independence, right, 1948, the Six-Day War in 1967, or the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about the two intifadas that have occurred more recently, all right? And an intifada is a war, but it's a different kind of war. So even if you include those, Israel has never been the aggressor. The closest we get to defining Israel as an aggressor would be the Six-Day War of 1967. If you know the story of the war, the Six-Day War, Israel struck first. But the reason they struck first that morning is because the armies of Egypt and Syria and Jordan had been amassing for 3 weeks on their border, and they were getting ready to attack them. And because they had such a small military, because they had so few planes and tanks and everything else, they knew the only way that they could possibly maybe win again was to catch them off guard and to strike first. And you're going to see tonight how that story unfolds. But they've never been the aggressors. They have always been attacked without provocation by their enemies. So Israel has gone to great lengths to try and maintain peace with their neighbors and those that oppose them. So here's the dirty little secret of the peace negotiations that have been ongoing for decades in the Middle East, all right? The Palestinians nor the Arab nations want peace with Israel. They do not want peace. Now, I alluded to this a little bit back in that week one. If they did, we would already have peace in the Middle East because various prime ministers from Israel have offered the Palestinians and other Arab leaders over the years much of what they wanted, but those offers at the negotiating table have always been turned down, right? So 1947, November of 1947, the UN, when they were about to create the state of Israel, at that time were also going to create a second Palestinian state. And remember what I told you a couple weeks ago? What happened? The Arabs said no. So all this talk about a two-state solution now, it's all baloney. That could happen in 1947. And since 1947, the two-state solution has been offered to the Palestinians on multiple occasions by the Israelis themselves, and every time it gets shot down. Let me give you some other examples. On June 19th, 1967, after the Six-Day War was over, and remember, in the Six-Day War, do you remember the map that I showed you a couple of weeks ago? That initially, when the UN gave Israel their land did not include what major city that every Jew counts as beloved? Jerusalem, that's right. But they took the plan anyway, just so they could have their own land. And Israel was just a tiny, tiny landmass. And remember how I showed you and told you the story of how the landmass kept growing and growing? That every time the Arabs attacked them in war, that the Jews would win, and with the victory comes the spoils of war, which is your land. And that's how they grew. And you'll look at other maps. I'm going to show you, go back to the maps tonight. I'm going to show you what a fake map of Israel looks like, right? It's important for you to understand that because there are a lot of fake maps about the history of how Israel got their territory and what happened, and they're called propaganda maps that are put out there by the Arabs and the Palestinians to try and deceive people into the claim that Israel has stolen the land, all right? But you remember in 1967, when Israel goes to war against Egypt and Syria and Jordan, Israel wins the Sinai Peninsula that the Egyptians had owned and the Golan Heights. Right? They won that land. Well, after the Six-Day War was over, here is what Israel did. In 1967, they offered to Egypt to give back the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights in exchange for a lasting peace. Most people don't know that. 1967. So as soon as the Six-Day War is over, Israel turns right around, and because their desires for peace, they went to the prime minister of Egypt at the time, whose name was Anwar Sadat. So for most of you, you're familiar with that name. You're of an age that you're familiar with the name Anwar Sadat. He was the prime minister of Egypt. And they went to him, and they offered, in exchange for peace, to give back the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. That offer was rejected in September of 1967 by Anwar Sadat and the Arab states in something called the Khartoum Resolution. And the Khartoum Resolution contained what was called or became affectionately known as the three no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. And so that's pretty much been the stance of many of the Arab nations, and especially the Palestinians, for all of these decades. So here's an interesting piece of information for you. I didn't even know this until recently. In March of 1979, Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Menachem Begin, went to the Camp David peace accords that were brokered by President Jimmy Carter, whose wife just passed away this week. And Menachem Begin, along with Jimmy Carter, made the same offer to Anwar Sadat in 1979 that was made in 1967, that we will give you back the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights in exchange for peace. In 1979, Anwar Sadat, who was still the prime minister of Egypt at the time, accepted that offer. And do you know that since 1979, there has been no conflict between Egypt and Israel? There has been lasting peace. Now, here's the part I want you to see, because this is really important. this kind of frames out what we're going through right now. Did you know that that decision to make peace with Israel cost Anwar Sadat his life? After that agreement was inked, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by radical Muslim extremists because he negotiated with and made a peace treaty with Israel. So a guy that I grew up with, a pastor, and Bishop Robert Stearns is now the bishop of his church. He pastored the church for almost 60 years. Pastor Tommy Reed of the Tabernacle in Buffalo, New York, was a man who is well connected with lots and lots of people. And one of his close friends was good friends with Anwar Sadat. And so they had, after Anwar Sadat was assassinated, they had the privilege of hosting Anwar Sadat's wife at the Tabernacle in Buffalo because she was very friendly toward Christians, right? And so when she was there, she told Pastor Reed this. She said, "My husband knew that when he signed that treaty, he was signing his death warrant. But he made the courageous decision to sign the treaty anyway." He knew he was going to be assassinated. He knew the extremist radical Muslims would kill him for making that deal with Menachem Begin and the Jews. But he did it anyway. That's courageous leadership. Now, I want you to compare that example to that of Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. In 2000, President Clinton held the Camp David Accords. So we're talking now 11 years later. President Clinton held the Camp David Accords with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. And he was trying to get them, the Jews and the Palestinians, to come to a peaceful resolution. Ehud Barak agreed to give the Palestinians 97% of what they were asking for. 97% of everything that Yasser Arafat wanted. President Bill Clinton told Yasser Arafat that moment, "You have the power to bring peace to your people and peace to the Middle East by accepting this unbelievable agreement. You are sacrificing nothing here." Do you know what Yasser Arafat told President Bill Clinton? He said, "If I do this, if I sign this, I will be assassinated. So I'm not going to do it." Assassinated by who is the question? Radical Muslim extremists. So this is what we need to understand when you hear about all of these peace negotiations and why does war between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arabs, why is this conflict ongoing, continuous? It never stops. It's because they can't broker a peace because of the radical Muslim extremist forces that are involved. The ongoing war that you see is not between the Palestinians and the Jews. You have to see the bigger picture. It's between the radical Muslim extremist elements and the Jews / America. Because they refer to the Jewish people, they refer to Israel as little Satan, and guess what they call America? The big Satan. Everything you see happening right now over there in the Middle East, it is not about Jews versus Palestinians. It's about the Muslim extremist radical wing against Israel and against America, against our way of life and our way of living. It is bigger than the Palestinians. They are simply pawns in the equation. And that's why the attacks on Israel are always ongoing. So now let's go 8 years forward 2008, the prime minister of Israel is a man named Ehud Olmert. And he makes another generous and comprehensive offer to the Palestinians. This time, a peace plan which included giving back most of the West Bank, right? 97% of the West Bank was going to be given back into the control of the Palestinians, along with dividing control of Jerusalem, settlement of refugee issues, and giving other territories to offset for the proposed annexation of some Israeli settlements that were going to still remain in the West Bank. So all the fighting that goes into the West Bank right now, it's all about these remaining Israeli settlements that are in there, okay? And so they said, if you will leave those settlements alone, we'll give you 97% of the West Bank. We'll take 3%, but for the 3% we take, we'll give you other land that's equivalent to that. And so this deal was being talked about. It was being negotiated with a man called Mahmoud Abbas. Does that name ring a bell? Because Mahmoud Abbas has been in this whole negotiating effort right now for getting the hostages freed and all that. Mahmoud Abbas is a big player in the Arab world. And for the most part, he has been a good player because he's negotiated a lot of things. He's a fairly reasonable man. So Ehud Barak gives him this proposal. Mahmoud Abbas agreed that was not only a good deal for the Arabs, that it was an incredibly generous deal from the Israelis to the Arabs, to the Palestinians. But guess what happened? He didn't sign the deal. And the reason was because Hamas in 2008 would not let him. Again, the extremist Muslim radical element rules the day. All right? So the question is, what can you do with that? I mean, Israel on multiple occasions has been willing to give away the farm, to do things that they really shouldn't do for the cause of peace. And I'll tell you about another one in a few minutes, okay? So now let me make a statement. So understanding that, here's what has happened over nearly 20 years of rule by the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and nearly 20 years of rule in specific by Hamas, all right? Because we talked about how in 2005, as a part of one of the deals, Israel said, we will give the Gaza Strip back into the control of Palestinians for them to have free elections to elect a government that can rule them. And then what happened was Hamas came in before the elections, killed off all of their competitors, won the election, and there's never been an election since. It's a dictatorship, right? So over the last almost 20 years now of rule, here's the problem. Hamas has brainwashed and indoctrinated so many of the Palestinian people who have known nothing else but Hamas that there are now very few Palestinians that are left that are level-headed enough to negotiate with anymore. This is the problem. The only ones left to negotiate are Hamas. And within the population of the Palestinians that are there are still a number that do not like Hamas ruling over them. I'm going to show you something about that. Oh, nuts. I think I forgot to send that video to Pastor Brock. I sent him the other two, and I forgot to send that. I'll have to show it to you next week. But this is a problem that even the people in the Gaza Strip now have been so brainwashed. The children, the teenagers have been so brainwashed that it's hard to have any level-headed conversations with them, all right? So again, Israel's been under constant attack the entire time they've been a nation, not only with the three major wars, but I want you to think about if you lived in a nation where you were continuously exposed to unrelenting miscellaneous bombs and missiles. So that means that throughout the years, there have been countless bombings throughout Israel. In malls, in streets, in homes, in buses, in cars, in government buildings. You can go down the list. So that the Israeli people walked around never feeling safe because you didn't know you could be, in your favorite restaurant. You could be just going into a shopping, to get some groceries, and all of a sudden, a suicide bomber walks in and the whole place goes up in smoke. And so for decades, they've dealt with all that kind of stuff. The other thing that they've dealt with is down near the Gaza Strip in towns like Sderot and all of the other little towns around there, year after year, there has been countless missiles that have gotten launched from the Gaza Strip, inside Gaza, into those towns. Now, when it first started around 2007, all right, they were sending missiles into Sderot and those towns every single day. That went on for a period of 3 years. Can you imagine if your town had incoming missiles in every day for 3 years? And you didn't know when they were coming, the sirens would just go off and you run for the nearest shelter. How unnerving would that be? Now, in those early days, they were really dumb missiles. I mean, basically, they kind of just aimed them and shot them. They were very low level, it's just kind of like throwing a rock. Wherever it lands, all right? But more recently now, two things have happened. They're getting better missiles, and their missiles are now able to go further. So in what has happened in the more recent attacks, you're seeing missiles that are being launched from the Gaza Strip reaching Tel Aviv. That's a long way. Reaching Jerusalem. They never had that capability before. Those towns were never in question, right? So again, that kind of thing brings a very unnerving element that continues this conflict going. What people don't understand is Israel will just endure these missiles for a period of time. And they will not retaliate. And then finally, when they've had enough, they retaliate, and then the world cries foul. But what the world doesn't understand is there has literally been hundreds of missiles and rockets that have been coming into their towns that they've said nothing about, that they've tried to just ignore, hoping that they would stop, and they won't. And so finally it gets to the point where they've got to do something to stop it. So what do? They target the places the missiles and the rockets are coming from, and they blow up those places. And then eventually, Hamas rebuilds them, and then they start all over again, and it's this cycle. Again, what are we talking about here? We're talking about why is there continuous conflict? Because there are continuous attacks that never stop. Now, I mentioned something to you a moment ago called the intifadas. An intifada is a term that means this. It means shaking off. And the intifadas refer to the civil uprisings against Israel by Palestinians. So the Palestinians call their uprisings against Israel, their civil uprisings, intifadas. And there have been 2 intifadas so far. And though they're calling this current conflict a war, it could also be referred to as the third intifada. First intifada began in 1987, and it lasted until 1993 when the Oslo Peace Accords were signed, right? So you're looking at a period of about 6 years. And an intifada is a little bit different than a war in that an intifada is kind of this drip, 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 constant skirmishes, constant throwing rockets and missiles in, all that kind of stuff. It's not a full-scale war, but it's continuous and ongoing. All right? It's kind of like guerrilla warfare. All right, so the first one lasts 6 years, 1987, 1993. The second Intifada began in 2002, and it lasted for 3 years until 2005. And the result of the second Intifada was that Israel decided to turn over control of the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian people, which I talked about a moment ago, okay? And again, the goal was that they would have free and fair elections, and they'd put a good government in place, and there would be peace between Israel and the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians who lead there, and we now know how that's turned out. Not very well, okay? So, how do Palestinians that are living in the Gaza Strip feel about all this? Well, I forgot to give it to Pastor Brock. I had it in one thing, but they needed it in a different format. I have a video that I'll show you next week called Whispers in Gaza. And it's really interesting. It's done with animation. Does anybody know why they would do it with animation? It's these animated characters talking. Yeah, so they can't be identified. Because if they get identified, they're dead. All right? Because Hamas regularly eliminates any voices that rise up against them. But it's a really interesting 4-minute video where this group talks about how they feel about what Hamas is doing and what Hamas has done to their people. They talk about how good it was when Israel ruled over them and how they had food and water and health care, and now they've got none of that, all right? And so I'll show that to you next week since I didn't get it in the queue for tonight. Second reason that there's constant and continuous conflict is because of political manipulation. So I said this earlier, politicians, Palestinians, Arabs, they've been used as a pawn by Arab leaders, whether it's Yasser Arafat, whether it's the current regime in Hamas for political gain, okay? And we talked about the fact that a two-state proposal has been offered several times and turned down, and you would say, well, why do they do that? Because it's all political manipulation. Right? It's to the advantage of the Palestinians, especially Hamas, not the Palestinian people. It's not to their advantage, to Hamas to keep the Palestinians in a constant state of poverty and political oppression. Why do they do that? To make Israel look bad and to engender sympathy for the Arabs and the Palestinians so that they can continue to raise money. And you know that the problem is that the vast amount of money and aid that has been given to the Palestinians has wound up in the pockets of political leaders like Yasser Arafat and those that rule Hamas. Did anybody see the news story that was released about the 4 top Hamas leaders and their lifestyle? They're all billionaires. They're worth $3 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, and $3 billion. Those are the 4 top Hamas leaders. They do not live in the Gaza Strip. They don't even live in the Middle East. Not in Israel, not in that area. They live lavishly. They have lavish homes, lavish lifestyles, obviously as billionaires. Now, something's wrong with that picture, right? Where'd they get all that money from? Well, it's money that they took from aid. So we know that the money that's given in aid, that's why people in America are now saying, stop giving aid. Stop giving aid to Iran, stop giving. Why? Because they know that that money is going to line their pockets and it's going to buy weapons for which they're going to continuously attack Israel and, don't be fooled, the United States. So how is it? I think the last time I heard a figure was over the weekend. It was 88 or 93 rocket attacks on U.S. bases in the Middle East. It's crazy. Where are they getting this stuff? Right? Well, we're kind of funding them so that they can shoot at us. It's crazy. All right? And I think I told you a couple of weeks ago that Yasser Arafat, when he died, his widow moved to Paris, France, with a tidy sum of $300 million in her bank account. Yasser Arafat, the guy that claimed to be the poor Arab shepherd. And he was worth a lot more than he was worth $1 billion. Okay? So that's a second reason. A third reason is claims over ownership of the Temple Mount, Jerusalem, and the land. So there's this continuous ongoing conflict. What's the reason behind this? Because there is this claim that Israel should not be on the Temple Mount, they should not be in Jerusalem, and they shouldn't even be in the land. So during the Middle Ages, the Muslims conquered Jerusalem. And then later during the Crusades, the Christians took back Jerusalem from the Muslims. And then shortly after that, the Muslims reconquered Jerusalem. So literally for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Jerusalem was in control of the Muslims. All right? Why do they want control of Jerusalem? Because they want control of the Temple Mount, because the Temple Mount is sacred to both Jews and Muslims. All right? The Temple Mount is the place that's on Mount Moriah where Abraham offered up Isaac to God. All right? And for the Muslims, it's a sacred spot because I believe it's the place where they say that Muhammad ascended to God and whatever. But it's sacred for them, okay? So it's sacred to Muslims, to Jews, and to Christians. All right? Yes, it's where Muhammad apparently ascended to Allah. All right? So here's what has happened. All right? During the 1967 Six-Day War, and you're going to see this in the video tonight, this is one of the stories I want you to see, Israel won back control of the Temple Mount. How? Because they won Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. Now remember, the Jews had not been in control of Jerusalem since the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. We're talking a long, long time, almost 2,000 years. They have not been in control of Jerusalem. It's either been controlled by Muslims or for a short period Christian, but really for the most part, it was Muslims, okay? But in the 1967 Six-Day War, something unexpected happens, a miracle. And the Jordanians who were in there controlling Jerusalem up and leave. They literally leave. You're going to see the miraculous story. So the Jews go in and they take back Jerusalem. Now, remember I told you that for Israel it's always about peace, even to their own detriment at times. Do you know what happened after the 1967 Six-Day War where they took complete control of all of Jerusalem? All right? Today you understand that the Israelis only own how much of Jerusalem? Half of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is split into East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. And half of it is owned by Muslims and half of it is owned by the Jews. And the Jews have no access to the Temple Mount, only to the Western Wall, or what's called the Wailing Wall. That's the famous pictures that you see, all right? You say, well, how could that be if in 1967 they won Jerusalem? Because the prime minister of Israel at the time, as an act of peace and to show their goodwill and intentions, returned the Temple Mount to a group called the WAQ, W-A-Q-F. They were a Muslim group who had been caretakers of the mount and the mosque, the Dome of the Rock that sits there, that iconic picture, for centuries. So even though they had won back the Temple Mount, they turned it back over to the Muslims as a gesture of peace. Now, that was a shock. In fact, there were a lot of Israelis that were very upset at their prime minister for doing that, okay? But it shows you the length to which Israel has gone to try and get along with their neighbors. And then, of course, in recent time, the great areas of contention have been the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and they've made concessions there. Okay? So why does this battle rage on? Because of the contention over these different pieces. Reason number 4 is this: the perception that Israel is a bully. Again, since 1948, Israel has been accused of stealing land, treating Arabs and Palestinians badly. Right? So I didn't really get to talk about this in week 1, but I want to talk about this idea of Israelis treating Palestinians or any Arab group badly or being bullies, okay? I want to take a moment to look at the historical map of the territory. I said a few moments ago, when you look at Google Maps, it's important that you know that there are fake maps and there are real maps, okay, of what has happened historically in the land. So I want to show them to you. First of all, I want you to take a look at this map. This is a real map, okay? What designates it as being real? Well, the first 2 slides are an important clue that you're looking at a progression, a historical progression of real maps. Here's why. The map on the far left side shows you who owned the territory prior to the British taking it over in 1917, 1918. Who owned the territory? The Ottoman Empire owned that territory for a long, long time, for centuries. Okay? So what is the story? What's the narrative that is often told to say that Israel is a bunch of bullies and that they stole our land? On a fake map, here's what that territory looks like. Do you notice any difference in the map that's on the far left side? It does not say Ottoman Empire. It does not say British Empire. They want you to believe that the Palestinian people, which, by the way, remember, what did I tell you in week 1? There was no group called the Palestinians, no Palestinian people group until what year? Does anybody remember? Santa will bring you an extra present if you get this. Pretty close, 1968. Remember, it was the idea that the Russians gave to Yasser Arafat. It was a way he could raise money and engender sympathy, okay? And get people to hate the Jews. So notice what they do. They want you to believe that Palestine always owned that land, right? But let's go back to the real map again. For centuries, it was owned by the Ottomans. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire lost, and so it was taken over by the British. And remember in week 1, I talked all about the Balfour Declaration, 1917, and Britain's intent to turn the land over to the Jewish people so that they would have a place to call their own, all right? And so you can see that the British controlled what was simply called the land of Palestine. Here's another important thing that you need to understand. Does anybody know where we get the name Palestine from? Who named that particular piece of land Palestine? Does anybody know? Not the Palestinians, because there were no, it was the Romans. The Roman Empire named it Palestine as a dig, as a derogatory term against the Jews. Because remember, you've heard me preach about this often enough, or you've been in my New Testament class where we study the history of the New Testament. The Roman Empire began to persecute who? The Jews and the Christians. But they began to persecute the Jews, blame the Jews, and so they changed the name of that territory to Palestine. And in Latin, it's Palestrina or something like that, and it has a very negative connotation towards Jews. So it was changed to be offensive to the Jewish people. So again, when you see Palestine, it doesn't mean there were Palestinian people living there. It was just called the land of Palestine, and you had all kinds of people that were living in that land. But there weren't a lot of people living in that land. Do you know why? Because the majority of it was arid and dry, barren, desert wasteland. So nobody really wanted to live there because they couldn't farm there. They couldn't grow anything there until you got into the northernmost parts where like Galilee is, where it gets a little nicer. All right? So you had lots of people, including Jewish people, that were living in the land of Palestine, but there was no Palestinian people group until 1968. All right? So I wanted to show you this progression of maps, and then you can see in 1948, again, just as a reminder, look at the land that was given to Israel. All right? The original land under the UN resolution is picture number 3 there. Look at how small Israel is. Do you see how tiny that is, that little sliver and a little bit up above? But the original proposal was that all that land, look at where Jerusalem is, all of that was going to be Arab Palestine. That was going to be their own state. And that's what they turned down. And then after the Arab-Israeli War, the War of Independence in 48, notice how Israel grows, because they win the territory in war. And then after the 6-Day War, look what happens. Now Israel adds the Sinai Peninsula, because they win that from the Egyptians, right? But then notice when we go back to the Yom Kippur War, Israel's not in control. You know, well, you still have that Sinai Peninsula, but they've rearranged the map. And then as you go forward again, all that land is given back, or 1979, pardon me, yes. So the second to the last one on the right, notice that Israel no longer controls the Sinai Peninsula. Why? Because of what I told you, the agreement between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, the Camp David Accords with Jimmy Carter, they give it back. So notice how Egypt has a thing again. And then in the final slide, the truth is, all of those places in green in the West Bank were given back, as well as the Gaza Strip, to the Palestinians. And remember, they were offered 97%, because what you see there is not 97%. They were offered 97% of the West Bank. And Abbas turned it down because radical extreme Muslim groups say, we don't negotiate, we're not doing that. We want it all. All right? So again, that's the real map. This is the fake map right here, the inaccurate. All right? And you can see how very different it is from the real map. So I wanted to point that out to you tonight because I wanted to make sure that you understood the difference between the two. Second, I want to tell you a story about the lie of mistreatment that began with the 650,000 Arabs displaced in 48. I told you that story, right? How about in the War of Independence, the Arab nations said, you guys need to get out, and then when we win, you can come back in. And 650,000 Arabs got stranded outside of Israel, and after the war was over, Israel said, whatever Arabs stayed in, we'll give them citizenship, voting rights, everything, which those citizens have today, all right? But the others can't come back in, and then their Arab brothers wouldn't receive them into their nations, and they became wanderers, and that 650,000 has now turned into 5 million people, all right? Again, Israel gets blamed for that, but it was their own brothers that did that, right? Interesting fact, the United States gives more aid to help the Palestinian refugees than all the Arab states combined, who give virtually nothing to their brothers. Do you know that the Arab nations don't give anything? Who supports the Palestinians? Mostly it's the United States, the United Kingdom, and some other gracious nations, okay? It's often said that Israel treats the Palestinians like the Germans, Nazis treated the Jews in World War II. That's ridiculous. First, the Jews aren't exterminating Palestinians, all right? There is no ethnic cleansing taking place. Second, Israeli policies are dictated by the need to defend themselves against attacks. That's what you're seeing right now. It's also been said that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is comparable to apartheid in South Africa. Not true, because in Israel, Arabs are full citizens with voting rights, and they have representation in government. In fact, Israel is the only place in the Middle East where Arab women can vote. Israel has a population that is 21% Arab. Okay? Israel's human rights record does not even compare to the Arab nations surrounding it. All right? So a lot has been said about the fence that Israel built in the West Bank. How many of you know about the fence that was built all along the West Bank? All right? So if I go back to this map here, and you look at the West Bank, look at either the third or fourth, fifth slide over, that West Bank, Israel had to build a fence. Why did they build the fence? People say, well, that's apartheid. No. The reason they built the fence was they had to protect their property and their citizens after the first Intifada, because the Arabs were coming from the West Bank into Israel, and this is where all the suicide bombers were coming in, and they were creating all this trouble. And so that's why Israel had to build the wall, to keep them out for security and protection, okay? In a 2-year period between 2008 and 2010, the world gave $7.7 billion to people in Gaza. So one must wonder, why is there no change in their circumstance? Why are they still dirt poor, living in poverty, living in squalor? Hamas is the answer, okay? And so we could go on and on and on about that. So I want to tell you a story about this guy right here. He is one of my favorite rabbis. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. He brought back to life, literally, he rebuilt the ancient city of Efrat that you read about in the Bible, right? And so I had the privilege in 2008 of spending 3 days with Rabbi Shlomo Riskin in what was the first Christian Orthodox Jew dialogue to ever take place. And so we sat in a hotel in Jerusalem for 3 days, and we learned from Orthodox rabbis, and then we taught them. And we discussed the Bible, and we went back and forth. And this guy is brilliant. I have 2 of his commentaries on the Old Testament, and they are amazing. He is a phenomenal guy. He actually grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and he was the rabbi for the largest synagogue in Brooklyn, New York, until a number of decades ago. He made Aliyah. Does anybody know what Aliyah is? Aliyah is the term for Jews who return to the homeland. So when a Jew returns to Israel, it's called making Aliyah. He felt the call of God to return to Israel and to restore the ancient city of Efrat. Now, when he did that, he built a state-of-the-art hospital and state-of-the-art schools. Now, here's what's interesting about where Efrat sits. Efrat is surrounded by Palestinian communities. And so what Rabbi Shlomo Riskin did was he offered free medical help, free education, and food to the poor Palestinian communities that surrounded Efrat. And so they began to come. They used the hospitals. They went to school with the Jewish kids. They were being fed when needed. And they were very grateful, and there was a great relationship between those Palestinian communities and Rabbi Shlomo Riskin and his people. That was until Yasser Arafat discovered what was happening. And you know what Yasser Arafat did? He went into those Palestinian communities and towns, and he told the people, if we catch you in those Jewish hospitals or Jewish schools or taking food from the Jews, we will come into your towns and we will kill every last one of you. And from that point on, they never saw another Palestinian in a frat. I want you to know that Israel has treated its people and all people in Israel with kindness, all right? Reason number 5 that I want to give you for the constant conflict is media distortions and lies. And I'm just going to give you one example of this. In 2002, the media reported a massacre in a town called Jenin. Jenin has actually been mentioned during this conflict. And the media report was that Israel went in and slaughtered hundreds of people, hundreds of innocent Palestinian Arabs in Jenin after a suicide bomber killed 87 Israeli citizens and wounded 570 others. Okay? It was one of the biggest suicide bomber killings that they had done to date. They killed 87 Jews, injured 570. So this media report came out that Israel went in there and slaughtered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these Palestinians. That did not happen. Canadian reporter Martin Himmel reported this fact in his documentary, Jenin, Massacring Truth. He went in and he discovered the truth. The United Nations actually reported that the number of Palestinian fighters that the Jews went in and killed was 26 Palestinians and 26 civilians, not hundreds and hundreds. And so in his report, Martin Himmel talks about the massacring of truth and tried to set the record straight. But to this day, so that you know, if you ever hear someone talk about the senseless massacre that happened in Jenin, you need to set them straight. That was a propaganda lie. It never happened. Israeli forces went in and killed the 26 Palestinian fighters that were responsible for planning that heinous attack. So you know this already. Again, we have this continuous conflict because of the media, all right? Because of media distortions and media lies, it keeps all this stuff alive. And then finally, the 6th reason that I want to give you is that Arab-Palestinian leadership continually calls for the total destruction and annihilation of Israel and the Jewish people. All right? So you want to know why there's never any peace? Well, how can you have peace when people are constantly calling for your destruction? Makes sense, right? So I wanted to share those things with you because a lot of times people get confused as to like, well, why does this thing just go on and on? Why can't they just settle it? Well, I just gave you 6 reasons why it doesn't get settled, all right, for your understanding. So when you're talking to people, you have facts. Now, I want to take our last 30 minutes tonight, and I want to show you 2 videos. And then I have some other stuff I want to share, 10 interesting facts about Israel that you may not know. I'll share with you next week. But these are 2 videos. The first video is called 6 Days of Miracles. And it's just kind of a brief overview of what happened in the 1967 war, okay? About all the miracles that happened in order for Israel to be able to defeat Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. And in that time, Egypt had the largest army in the Middle East, a very sophisticated, well-run army, military. They had all the bells and whistles, all right? And they get embarrassed. And it's called 6 Days of Miracles. And then the second one that I want you to see is called When Heaven Altered the Course of History. Right? And it's about the return of the Jews to Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years. Okay? And the reason I want to show these 2 videos to you is because I want you to have confidence that when God speaks something, he does it. And when God said, I will protect my people, I will bring them back to the land, and I will protect them, he does it. So watch this.
News brings you the latest incident to upset the chancelleries of
the Muslim nations in the Middle East would not accept Israel's existence since its founding in 1948. They began amassing huge amounts of sophisticated weaponry and lobbying for the implementation of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against the Jewish state. On the 15th of May, 1967, on Israel's Independence Day, a 3-week period began, which was one of the most tense and fearful periods in Israel's history. In direct contravention of international agreements, Egyptian leader Jamal Abdel Nasser removed the UN peacekeeping forces and began moving tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks into what was the demilitarized Sinai Peninsula towards Israel's southern border. Egypt also blockaded the Straits of Tiran, an open international waterway which was essentially a declaration of war. Israel turned to the nations of the world, primarily to the United States, for assistance against Egyptian aggression, but somehow all Western countries decided to remain neutral. Very quickly, it became apparent that the promises were all but forgotten. Israel, with 2.5 million Jews, was left alone to face the might of the Arab nations. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon formed a military alliance and began moving forces into Jordan towards Israel's borders. When the Arab countries realized that the world had abandoned Israel, many other Muslim countries were openly calling for the destruction of Israel. The will and means to murder millions of Jews were evident. Top IDF commanders expressed their concerns at the high price Israel was liable to pay in a war with the Arab world. Some military experts projected a toll between 20 and 100,000 lives. Israel prepared cemeteries all over the country, ready to accommodate many expected victims. Massive parks were prepared in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and other cities in case the cemeteries would have no more space. World governments, instead of defending Israel's right to exist, warned Israel continuously not to attack. However, the people of Israel had no choice but to go to war, to defend their country and their very existence. At 7:15 a.m. on June 5th, 1967, the IDF launched Operation Moked, Focus. Almost the entire Israeli Air Force was dispatched in a daring mission. Only 12 planes stayed behind. The risk of this operation was extraordinary, as the fighter pilots flew at an unprecedented low altitude of less than 20 meters above the ground. Egypt had the most advanced ground-air missile defense systems in the Middle East. Most of the Israeli jets were old and outdated French planes. If the Israeli jets would have been detected, many would have fallen, and Israel would have been left with practically no air force. And then, a miracle occurred. The most advanced Russian MiG jets that patrolled the airspace along the borders between Egypt and Israel were, for that one critical hour, grounded. Incredibly, at that very same time, the top commanders of Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq flew together to observe the Egyptian forces invading Sinai. The Egyptian officers had ordered all anti-aircraft units not to fire unless given a direct order as long as they were in flight. This created total confusion on the Egyptian ground as Israel struck exactly in that window of time. By 7:45 a.m., the high hand of Providence resulted in the Israeli Air Force reaching all the Egyptian airfields without even one plane being detected. More than 200 Egyptian planes, almost half of Egypt's fleets, were almost instantaneously destroyed, also bombing the runways and making impotent the mightiest air force in the Middle East. General Moti Hod, commander of the Air Force, said, "In my wildest dreams, I never would have conceived of such an incredible success." A second wave of Israeli jets were directed to Cairo to confront the remains of the Egyptian Air Force. And here, another miracle occurred, no less miraculous than the first. Even though Israel had lost the element of surprise and the anti-aircraft systems were operating with full capacity, Egypt was only able to hit one Israeli plane. The Israeli Air Force went on to destroy a total of more than 300 Egyptian planes, and every airfield in Egypt was neutralized. It was nothing less than a military miracle, seemingly impossible. And then, another miracle occurred. It was as if God hardened the heart of the Egyptian president Nasser, who continuously gloated about his glorious military victory over Israel. In the Arab media, President Nasser spoke of the end of Israel's air force and of the Egyptian tanks on their way to Jerusalem. Jordan, Syria, and Iraq believed these bombastic statements and wanted to join him in the great victory against the Jews. All the Arab air power struck simultaneously on multiple fronts. In almost any other scenario, Israel would not have been able to respond as quickly as it did. The timing was seemingly orchestrated to position Israeli jets exactly where they should be. Not in 6 days, but in 6 hours, the war was won.
A biblical prophecy comes to pass as the forces of Israel sweep on in an astonishing triumph of strategy. After achieving air supremacy, her forces thrust like an avenging sword at the very heart of Arab self-confidence.
And then, perhaps, the greatest miracle of all, a miracle Israel never expected: Jerusalem. Again, it seemed as though it was a divine appointment in time. Jerusalem was to be restored to the Jewish people after 2,000 years. The enemies of Israel had twice as many soldiers as we did, 3 times as many planes, 4 times as many tanks. The odds were stacked against us on every military front. The love of Israel, self-sacrifice, and courage of the Israeli soldiers, combined with divine guidance and assistance, made these miracles possible. Yitzhak Rabin, then the Minister of Defense, was given the honor of giving the war its name. He chose the 6-day war, recalling the 6 days of creation, as Israel too was created with the liberation of Jerusalem. As the center of gravity of the Jewish people has now returned to the land of our fathers, the Torah center of the world has once again returned to Jerusalem. The chief rabbinate of the State of Israel has established the 28th of Iyar, a day of Hallel and Hodayah, praise and thanks for the salvation of our people and the liberation and return of our capital, Jerusalem. Jews in Israel and in every country in which they reside come together in prayer and celebration. Similar to Hanukkah and Purim, it sometimes takes many years for the miracles to be fully recognized and celebrated. The Mizrahi World Movement is involved in massive community-wide celebrations across the globe, from London to Los Angeles, from Melbourne to Johannesburg to Chicago and Toronto. For 2,000 years, our hope never died. Our faith as a people never wavered. Wherever Jews were and whenever they prayed facing Jerusalem. Whatever happened the night before, whether it was the Crusades, the Inquisition, Muslim oppression, or Nazis in Germany, the next morning a Jew would wake up, dust himself off, put on his talit, face Jerusalem, and pray to come home, knowing somehow, some way, God would bring us back. This is our greatest celebration. To be alive in this generation, where the prayers of our fathers and mothers have finally been answered, to be alive and to take part in Jewish destiny. To experience miracles of divine providence, bayamim hahem, bazman hazeh, like in those days, but in our time.
There is no rational way to explain the remarkable circumstances that led to the liberation of the old city of Jerusalem in 1967. It was one of the most unexpected and inexplicable phenomena in the history of human warfare. There was no battle plan for Jerusalem whatsoever. Israeli intelligence never expected the impending confrontation to include Jordan, which had been in control of the old city since 1948. In the south, Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, in contravention of international law, had closed the Straits of Tiran and sent 100,000 troops and thousands of tanks into the demilitarized Sinai Peninsula, a clear act of war. Tensions were also building on the Syrian border in the north. Israel expected a war in two fronts, north and south, but certainly not with Jordan in the east. Unbeknown to Israel, Jordan had signed an agreement with Egypt, placing the entire Jordanian army under the direct command of Egypt's chief of staff, General Riyad. It was Nasser's plan to unleash a triple-pronged attack from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which he believed the young state of Israel could not defend, and he would finally avenge the defeat of 1948. On the first day of the war, the Jordanian forces began shelling major cities across Israel, including heavy bombardment of Jewish West Jerusalem. Israel repeatedly implored the Jordanians to cease fire and promised they would not react. Once all diplomatic attempts failed, Israel had no choice but to defend herself and enter the unplanned fray in Jerusalem. Rabbi Yoel bin Nun, a member of the Paratrooper Reserve Brigade 55 under the command of Mota Gur, recalls the surprising change in plan. On the first day of the war, he and his fellow soldiers were en route to El Arish in Sinai when they received an urgent command to redirect to Jerusalem. The IDF now had only a few hours to familiarize themselves with the routes and topography in and around the capital. With only partial intelligence, a dire lack of East Jerusalem maps, and in complete darkness, the troops charged into battle at 2 a.m. early Tuesday morning on the second day of the war. It was then the paratroopers engaged in the fierce battles of Ammunition Hill, the American colony, and Wadi Joz, and suffered the worst day of losses in their unit's entire history, losing 100 soldiers in these battles. In comparison, the very same brigade fought for 2 weeks in the Yom Kippur War and lost 52 soldiers, half of those lost on this one blood-drenched day. However, despite the heavy price, Brigade 55, together with the Harel and Jerusalem brigades, had almost surrounded the Old City. That very night, Mota Gur had a breathtaking conversation with Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the chief rabbi of the IDF. While in the Rockefeller Museum at the northeastern tip of the Old City, awaiting orders, the rabbi said to him, "Mota, Jewish history obligates you to liberate the Old City." Mota replied that while he draws great inspiration from Jewish history, he takes his orders only from his superiors. "Mota," said Rav Goren, "Jewish history will not forgive a Jewish commander who had the opportunity to reclaim Jerusalem and did not do so." Moshe Dayan, the defense minister in the unity government, had ordered them not to capture the Old City for two reasons. Firstly, the intention of this defensive war was never to conquer the Old City and its holy sites, sacred to many religions. Secondly, he was aware of the large Jordanian military presence in the Old City, especially on the Temple Mount, with huge amounts of artillery and ammunition. Having seen the devastating losses on that one day, Dayan anticipated much greater losses in hand-to-hand street combat, especially in defense of the holy places. This would be a battle that Israel would not fight, or so he thought. What he did not realize was, in Rav Soloveitchik's famous words, that divine destiny was knocking at the door. The drama of Jewish destiny was about to unfold. That very same night, two utterly unexpected and unpredictable events occurred. The first, in a remarkable display of unity, left-wing Yigal Allon and Menachem Begin from the right came together as one to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol to intercede on behalf of Jerusalem. Now was the time to liberate the holy city. The emergency cabinet heavily debated the issue, with many concerned that the world would not tolerate a Jewish conquest of Jerusalem and that Israel should not attack. Eventually, Moshe Dayan's decision was overruled and the cabinet gave the green light. It was time to return to Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years, at any cost. At that very same time, another dramatic decision was being made. The commander of the Jordanian troops in the Old City, sensing the inevitable and realizing he was surrounded, requested permission to retreat over the Mount of Olives and back over the Jordan River. General Riyad gave his approval, and the Jordanians fled that very same evening. Our sages describe how Jerusalem is the only city in the world that exists on two planes, in heaven and on earth. Jerusalem on high and Jerusalem down below. Nothing happens in Jerusalem on high unless it happens concurrently in Jerusalem below. Perhaps at the very moment of both debates between the rabbi and the commander and within the cabinet in the city below, a similar debate was taking place in the heavenly cabinet. Were the Jewish people worthy of returning to Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh? Was this the moment they'd been waiting for 2,000 years, or would they have to wait 2,000 more? Would there be more devastating loss of life in a battle on the mountain of God, or would there be a more merciful outcome? As we know, divine mercy won the day. Yisrael would not have to wait any longer, and little blood would be spilt on that epic day in Jerusalem in June 1967. The hand of heaven was moving history forward. When Mota Gur positioned himself on the Mount of Olives the next morning, preparing for the battle of his life, he was astounded. There was barely a Jordanian soldier in sight. After a few minor skirmishes, and mercifully with very little loss of life, Mota Gur proclaimed the iconic words, Har Habayit B'Yadeinu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. Israel had accomplished what seemed impossible with all the political predictions and military assessments from just a few days before. The Jewish people had returned home.
אני יורד ברגע זה, אני יורד במדרגות אל הכותל. אינני אדם דתי, מעולם לא הייתי, אבל זהו הכותל, ואני נוגע באבני הכותל המערבי.
Extraordinary turn of events is another powerful reminder of the meaning of Jewish life. Our collective journey on earth cannot be separated from our heavenly odyssey. Individual and national master plans cannot be severed from the master's plan. The very existence of Israel and Jerusalem is a constant testimony to the inextricable bond between human history and divine providence, between Jewish destiny and our spiritual destination.
So can you imagine being one of those soldiers after 2,000 years where the Jewish people have not been able to access the Western Wall, which is the Western Wall of the temple, and they overtake Jerusalem because basically the Jordanians flee. And here they are for the first time in 2,000 years saying, the Temple Mount is ours, the Western Wall is ours. Can you imagine this celebration? And what I just want to encourage you with tonight is God is faithful. God keeps his word. Sometimes it may take 2,000 years. And for some of you, in things that you've been waiting for God to do, it feels like 2,000 years. But I just want to encourage you tonight. We're now in the Christmas season, a season of miracles. God is faithful. He keeps his covenant with his people. He will do what he promised to do for you. And I wanted you to see those videos because to me, those videos tell the incredible story of the miracles that God has done. There is no way on earth that Israel should exist. They've always been outmanned, outgunned, out everything. But God, right? But God. So, Holy Spirit, tonight, I just thank you for your faithfulness to your covenant. Not just to the Jewish people, but Lord, your covenant to every one of us that is within the sound of my voice tonight. Lord, I just pray for those who need a miracle tonight. They need a miracle in their family, or they need a miracle in their body. They need a miracle in their finances, whatever it may be. That tonight, these videos will just instill faith and confidence that you see exactly what they're going through. And at the right time, you are going to move, and you're going to be faithful, and you're going to provide, and you're going to do the impossible. So tonight we thank you that you've never let us down and you never will. Amen. All right. Well, we're going to conclude there for tonight. Thanks for being here. We have 2 weeks left. Next week, I'm going to talk about 10 interesting facts about Israel, stuff that people don't know about the land of Israel. And then I'm going to talk to you about the Holocaust next week, and information that you need to know about that. And then on our final week, I have something very special that I always like showing people. Something really, really, again, another inspirational story that I want you to see that's really going to touch your heart and really encourage you as we wrap up our series, all right? So God bless you. Again, if you have questions, you can email them to me. Next week, I'll leave some time at the end for questions in these next 2 weeks, and so kind of write them down, and then we'll go through all that, all right? All right, God bless. Have a great night. Thanks for those of you that were joining us online. And don't forget, we start our new Christmas series this week called Narnia, Christmas Journey. It's going to be incredible. We're going to have some fun stuff up on the platform and stuff that we're doing.